Hello, welcome to the Butter Web Design Podcast. My name is Ryan Lowe, and today we're going to be talking about 5 things web designers know that you don't. Thing number 1 is web designers know what not to do. Having double drop downs is a good example of that. Forgetting to add the alternate descriptions to images is another example of what not to do. Web designers, you might not know this, but web designers probably spend more time writing code that doesn't work than code that does. I know when I was writing a lot of code custom myself, I would be kind of coding out what I thought was pretty close to what was going to happen, and then I would publish and look at the results, and it would be pretty close to what I wanted, but you're not really finished writing your code until you've made all these mistakes, and then the end result of all the mistakes is something that works really well. But there's so much trial and error in that is valuable, that web designers kind of get to go through that coding process that your average Joe might not have the benefit from. And when you multiply that out over the years that a web designer might be writing code and working on this trial and error process of building websites, we start to learn that not only does it frustrate the user to try to interact with a menu that, for example, a drop-down menu that has drop-down menus in it, maybe 2 or 3 levels deep, but it's also explicitly advised against by the W3C, which is an organization that creates web standards for building websites and making sure that content that you publish online is compliant with accessibility guidelines. So people who are using e-readers or have other visual impairments are still going to be able to interact with your website. So that's where you get into AODA compliance and things that I'm not going to address fully on this podcast, but suffice it to say that maybe in year 5, building website number 6 of that year, I'll come across an AODA requirement and go, oh, wow, I really need to have more contrast on this link, or I need to have more padding around this button so that when people are interacting with it, it's going to be accessible, it's going to be easier to use. So these are all the trial and error level things that web designers end up discovering through this long process of coding that average Joes might not. The next thing that web designers are aware of that your average Joe might not be is not in the coding side of it, but it's the design principles piece. And I see this a lot when I get into a meeting with a new client where they've presented me with all of this information with which they've written internally, and it makes great sense to them because they're so familiar with their products and services that they're writing almost at an expert level of knowledge. And it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of the person who just stumbles across your site, so your prospect, and to cater your content for that person so that when they're interacting with your content, you're writing almost as if you're speaking to a child. So it's really simplified. It's not this high academic language. It's actually much more pared down and concise, and it actually takes a lot longer to write copy that is concise and brief and straight and direct and to the point than it is to write out big paragraphs. And that's why so few people do it, is the extra work that goes into writing a short, concise sentence. It's simply it's a high effort activity. So designing your text in such a way as to have a hierarchy, something that makes sense in terms of what you're attracted to reading first, having your high level, most important information maybe a bit larger or in an accent color, creating call to actions where you're actually directing the user behavior a little bit and having them accomplish the goals that you know they're coming to your website to accomplish, as well as accomplishing the goals that you have for them on the website. Now, those are 2 goals that might be a little bit different. They might be the same. One of them might be, for them, they might want to access some free information, and a goal for you might be to collect their email address so you can continue to market to them over the long term. So designing that hierarchy, working with alignment, figuring out what information needs to go into your navigation, your most important navigational links, these are all aspects of design and user experience and user interface that a web designer puts a lot of subconscious and conscious consideration into that your average, hobbyist designer might not have the same level of aptitude for. The third thing a web designer knows how to do that your average Joe might not is how to work in teams. And this becomes important when you take your marketing to the next level and you need your web designer to work with maybe some agency that specializes in search engine optimization. So that agency might not have a web designer on staff, and they might need landing pages to be built, or they might need email integration or mailing list service integration to be applied to your website through the embedding of a JavaScript code. These are things that a web designer is going to know how to do, which if you've built your own website, might be a bit harder for you. You might need to hire somebody to take care of that embedding. So it kind of comes back to that knowing how to code piece, right? So the fourth thing that web designers know how to do is optimize websites for search. And SEO is a catchphrase that's been thrown around a lot, and it changes at all times. It's a moving target. Optimizing your website for search has to do with complying with all of those W3C standards that we talked about before, making sure text size is legible on mobile devices, but also feeding the search engine when it crawls your site, feeding that search engine with the right information at the tag, sort of the correct hierarchy of the tag that it's crawling at that time. And I don't think I described that very well, so I'll try it again. You need to be able to, through your code, tell the search engine what your website is about. And that can be done through your meta tags. So the keywords tag isn't as important anymore, but your title tag for your website is, as are the heading tags. So each of the tags that you use to title your pages in terms of the page, the titles that go above the text, not the browser tag pages themselves. And then also coming back to that alternate tag for your images, making sure you're using keyword appropriate and yet also descriptive of the image, alternate tags. And considering your inbound links and your outbound links, as well as what content is cornerstone content, what content is evergreen versus maybe more of the moment, so sort of this trending content, and balancing a good blend of that stuff and having a good ratio where if you're running an email list, you can have maybe 4 really high value free pieces for one promotional, self-promotional piece. I think the mistake that a lot of businesses run into is they'll start to blog, but they're blogging about their own business versus trying to put out content that is directly beneficial to the people who they're trying to market to. And that's really the sweet spot there, is when you're able to give them content that they want on sort of a free basis. And then by virtue of you producing that really high value free content for them, they start to see you as an expert. And then once they trust you as an expert, that's that big sales piece of trust where people want to buy from people that they trust. So that's kind of where you are marketing yourself, even though it might feel like you're giving away your best information. That unto itself can be a great way to optimize your website and get more traffic through search. The fifth and final point for what web designers know how to do that your average Joe doesn't is how to code and how to fix things when it breaks. So as with the beginning of any relationship with anything, like if you buy a brand new car, that car is probably going to run really well for a few years. And then after that, as time goes on, without the proper maintenance, that car might fall into disrepair and start to cause problems. It's the same thing for a website. A website is different than a book in that you buy a book, you leave it on your shelf, you can read it whenever you want. It's not really changing. The interaction with the book is very static. Whereas with a website, because the browsers that are viewing your website are constantly changing, because the devices phones, computers, tablets, all of those devices are constantly changing and updating. So your website has to also be updated in order to accommodate those changes. Now, a web designer is going to be at the very bleeding edge of what's happening in that industry and know what changes need to be made for your website to continue to work really well across time. So when things break, it's handy to have a web designer there to help you out. So those are the 5 things that we're looking at in terms of the definition of a web designer, what a web designer can do that an average Joe might not, and where you might need to check in with a web designer if you're having any of those issues. The final thing that I'll close with is if you want to check out 7 ways to get high value leads to your website for free without even having a website, like you could send these people to your phone number, you could have them email you. This is a great way to get started. I've put together a checklist of those, which I'll link to in the description below if you're watching the video, or if you're listening to the podcast, you can go to butterwebdesign.com to get that free email marketing list. And thanks for watching.